Hello, everybody. My name is Yanelli Guzman. I am majoring in psychology at California State University, Fullerton, with a concentration in forensic psychology. And I will be presenting my McNair and Senior Honors Project thesis, which is titled Observing Aversive Bias in Court Cases Dealing with Defendants Suffering from Mental Illnesses. To begin with, a lot of people do not understand the concept of aversive bias or never heard the term before. So aversive bias is the act of having attitudes that may affect one's understandings, actions, and decisions unconsciously. In other words, it could be seen as being biased towards a group of people. For example, walking across the street instead of walking right next to or in front of a homeless man. This study is very important since there's a statistic stating that 44 out of 50 states have prisons that hold more mentally ill individuals than the largest state psychiatric hospital in that state, which means that people that had mental illnesses prior to being committed are not receiving the medication or the treatment that they need in order to help them or withstand what they're going through mentally. Due to that, I decided to make this case, and I wanted to see whether people in the jury, for example, mock jurors, will take into consideration mental illness in a defendant that has committed a crime. The crime that I chose, which I thought was the most impactful, was murder. So the type of mental illnesses at some times in cases may also play a role. So I wanted to see that, as well as I wanted to see if the defendants were able to plead not guilty by reason of insanity, and if the mock jurors did choose the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. My hypothesis for this study was that the severity of a defendant's mental illness will substantially impact juror perceptions, which means that the level of the mental illness that I will be choosing, that I will later talk about which ones I chose and why, the jurors did make sure that they chose which one, and that they use the severity of the mental illness when it came to deciding the jury verdict and the sentence. The three mental illnesses that I chose, each one with a different defendant, was schizophrenia, depression, and no diagnosis, which means that they had no mental illness prior to committing the murder. With that being said, the other hypotheses are as followed. Jurors will show more leniency towards defendants with mental illnesses. Defendants with schizophrenia will have a more lenient sentence compared to defendant with depression or no mental illness. Since schizophrenia is a more severe mental illness, I believe that schizophrenia had more impact when it came to deciding the jury verdict, such as not guilty by reason of insanity, compared to depression. And then defendants with depression will have a more lenient sentence compared to a defendant with no mental illness. I also said this because depression should be more severe than having no mental illness at all, and since it is still a mental illness. In order to finalize my study, I went through the program called Tricks in order to make 3 mock court cases with the help of my mentor, Dr. Russ Espinoza. And each case had a defendant, either a defendant with schizophrenia, a defendant with depression, or a defendant with no diagnosis. These were all randomized, so not one participant got all 3. They either got one of the 3. So they were randomly assigned, and the independent variable were the mental state of each defendant, since I was looking at whether they took the mental illness into consideration, and the dependent variable would be the jury verdicts and the sentencing. As you can see in the middle of my poster, that in the first graph, schizophrenia on top, which is the giant blue one, shows that the verdict was a lot higher for not guilty by reason of insanity compared to depression, where there's possibly like 2, and compared to no diagnosis, which is like 1. So already you can see off the bat that the severity of mental illness, or that mental illness in general, did substantially impact the jurors' perceptions when it came to less severity and less harsh verdicts and sentencing. They were sentenced more lenient, their verdict was a lot more lenient. As well as in the second graph, you can see that comparing schizophrenia and no diagnosis, schizophrenia had a lot more lenient sentence, where they were either given not guilty by reason of insanity and released after treatment, so they didn't have to go to jail, or not guilty by reason of insanity and then given serving 20 years after they received treatment, compared to no diagnosis, where the majority chose guilty and life in prison. If you can see in depression, they also had a less sentencing compared to no diagnosis, but there were still a lot more guilty and life in prison compared to schizophrenia, and a lot more guilty when it came to sentencing. So the results are shown. The more severe the diagnosis mattered to jurors, as they gave the defendant with a more severity and more lenient verdict. And the more severe the diagnosis, jurors gave the defendants a much lesser sentence, also compared to no diagnosis of a mental illness whatsoever. However, with the study, there was limitations. The first was that defendants were only males. I did not include any female defendants, as I did not want to include any study of sex. I just wanted to solely think about the mental illnesses. And then there is minimal representation of entire population. I only had the study up for around 2 months, and only 80 people participated. There were a little bit more, over 80, but some of them, I think there was a glitch in the system and their answers weren't recorded. So I believe that the significance may increase with an increase in participants, as you can already see that they did substantially impact the jurors' perception. So I believe that if we had more people, we would see more of a bigger sample. So a follow-up study would be to add sex into this study, which I do want to include later on in the future, and see whether females would also impact jurors' perception. So would the results change if the sex of the defendant changed from male to female? I also wanted to do another study. Would results change when comparing different forms of mental illness with one another, impact in a different way? For example, the different levels of schizophrenia being compared to one another. Is one going to be more severe, and is one going to be given a more lenient sentencing compared to the other levels of schizophrenia? That's another follow-up study that I wanted to do. More studies on the non-guilty by reason of insanity verdict should be conducted, as previous literature do not show many mental illnesses being compared to one another, as well as the verdict not guilty by reason of insanity. Most of them only have one mental illness, and that's the entire case study. So I wanted to see more of comparisons and adding more to the literature. And then due to a different kind of case in the literature, results did strengthen current literature by contributing a new study with not just one defendant, like I said, but with a mental illness of 3 defendants. So that is a different part that I wanted to strengthen the literature by. I also wanted to thank my mentor, Dr. Russell Espinoza, as he did help me a lot with this study, the psychology department at Cal State Fullerton, and the entire McNair program, as if it wasn't for any of them, I probably would still be lost, as well as the senior, as well as the honors program. They helped me a lot, and I'm very thankful for them. Thank you, and that concludes my study of observing aversive bias in court cases dealing with defendants suffering from a mental illness. Thank you.